Hi everyone, it's Alice, and today we're doing another installment in my book recommendations by aesthetics series, and this time we're finally doing Dark Academia. In this series, as you may know, I recommend books to you and I talk a little bit about them and I make a mood board to go with each recommendation so you can get like a better sense of the atmosphere and the vibe of the book. I really like when book recommendations include something visual in them, and I just think it's a fun way to recommend books, so that's the idea. This particular aesthetic has been requested, and you know I love me a good dark academia book, so this is super easy for me to do. I do think dark academia is one of those things that you can sort of interpret in different ways. I sometimes refer to it as a genre, even though it's kind of a stretch to call it that. I think it's more one of those things that gives you an idea of the vibe and some of the themes. It's probably not an outright genre, but I also know that people interpret it in different ways. So today we're just doing my interpretation of what is dark academia. And I have a little bit of like a mix of all kinds of different books. Some of these books are like full on dark academia, like they're considered dark academia classics. And then other ones just have like a touch of the right vibe, if you know what I mean. Usually, though, books with dark academia vibes are books that include like higher education and art and literature, and I feel like they very often have like something dark and mysterious about them, and very often they have like a gothic edge to them, or they're just straight up gothic. At least that's how I think about dark academia. I also think that a common theme in these kinds of books are like secrets and obsession and power, and I feel like very often they have sort of morally ambiguous characters. And I love all of these things in books, so it's no wonder that I really like books that sort of fall into that or under that dark academia umbrella. The books that I've chosen, at least, I feel like fit this vibe, and it's gonna be interesting to make these mood boards because I feel like a lot of us have a visual idea of what dark academia is, and it's a very specific aesthetic. And I'm gonna try to make all of these mood boards like distinct from each other. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. We're going to start with what happens to be my favorite book, the one and only The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And of course we have to start with this one because I feel like this is one of the main like classic dark academia books. And I remember the first time I read this, it was years ago, and I read this book and I was like, wow, this this is setting a new standard for what an amazing book is for me because I just loved it so much. And I just loved all of the themes and everything in it. And I read this book before dark academia was a thing, or at least before I knew it was a thing. I always feel like when I summarize this book, it never fully captures like what this book is really about. But the story follows a group of eccentric students at an elite college in Vermont who are all studying under this charismatic Greek professor. And the story is all about the unraveling that takes place when the group basically turns on one of their own. Now, despite this being my favorite book, this is one of those books that I don't think is for everyone. It's very character driven, it's slow, and it's kind of dense. I really like that. Like, I love character driven stories, and I think this is like an amazing character study in a way, and I just think it's so fascinating. Like, all of the characters are very interesting, and I've read this book several times and I feel like I get something new from it each time. But I think it's just one of those books that's not going to hit everyone. But if you're into these kinds of books, this one is amazing. I also feel like the aesthetic for this is very easy to like capture. At least for me, I have a very specific idea of the aesthetic of it. And yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with this book. It's so good, and I could make so many mood boards for this. And yeah, I just think it's very interesting. It's very character driven though, and kind of a slow book, but I think it really works with the story, but I could see that it's probably not for everyone. Secondly, we have If We Were Villains by ML Rio, which has some similarities to The Secret History, I would say, but it's still very different. It starts off with a man being released from prison after having spent a decade in there, and when he gets out, a detective is waiting for him, and that's the detective who put him in prison, and he wants to talk to him and find out what actually happened back then. Then we go back a decade in time and we meet 7 students at this elite arts college, and they're all studying Shakespeare, and we sort of slowly peel back the layers of the characters and everything that happened. I really, really liked this one, and I loved all of the Shakespeare bits. Like, that's a big part of the story, even though I'm not like super familiar with Shakespeare. I felt like it didn't really matter, like, it still worked really well, and it was very easy to get into the story. And I feel like the Shakespeare and like the arts parts really added a lot to this. Now, I know not everyone agrees with this, but I personally think that if you don't like The Secret History, for the reasons that I mentioned, like it's slow and it's dense, if you don't like that book because of that, you might like this one instead because it's a little bit lighter. It's not as long. I mean, I say lighter, it's not lighter when it comes to like the themes and stuff, but it's a little bit easier to read, I would say. It's not as dense and it's not as slow. And you still get a lot of the same vibes, and obviously this is a completely different book and completely different story, but it has some similarities in the themes and the vibes and like this whole like dark academia thing. And I think if you don't like The Secret History, this is a good alternative, and it has a very strong aesthetic. And I do also think if you do like The Secret History, you would really like this one as well because it's a very good book. Then we have a classic. It's The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which, although this doesn't have an academic setting like a lot of dark academia books has, it delves like fully into intellectual obsession, moral decay, and beauty, and death. And it has a very, very gothic feel to it. You probably already know that the story in here is about a man who exchanges his soul for eternal beauty and youth. And he basically asks for this portrait of him to age instead of him and to like carry all the marks of a life. Like the portrait will do that instead of the man. And he keeps this thing locked away in his house like a terrible secret, and the story's all about how that goes. This is a book that I actually, when I read it, I really, really liked it, but I did not realize how much of an impact it was going to have on me and how much it was going to stick with me. I think about this book all the time, and I didn't really think that it was going to be one of those books when I finished it, but I just, yeah, I think about it a lot, and I actually want to reread it because I think it would have an even greater impact now. The aesthetics for this one feels very clear to me. We need some artsy vibes, some darkness, try to like capture that. And I feel like this book in a way is all about decay and like inner decay, and it's a very interesting story. I really recommend this. Even if you don't like dark academia, I think you might like this still. And if you're scared of reading classics, this is not that difficult to read, and it's not that long. So if you don't like long books, this is pretty easy to read. Next, we've got another one of my favorites. It's Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. And with this one, we're venturing a little bit into fantasy, but it's still set in our world. And the story starts off when we meet our main character, who has just survived this terrible tragedy, and she's the only survivor. And when she's in the hospital, she gets offered the opportunity, sort of out of nowhere, to enter Yale University. And in order to sort of earn her place, all she has to do is this particular job, which is to monitor the school's secret societies and everything that they get up to. To do this job, like, she's supposed to be trained by this guy who's currently holding that position, but he actually goes missing, which is unfortunate. So the story is in part about her, like our main character, trying to find out what happened to this guy, but it's also about her uncovering something dark going on in New Haven. And this dark thing definitely has something to do with like the occult practices of these secret societies. It's kind of complicated, but I loved this one. I gotta say though, it is dark. Like, it's properly dark. And I know that it's too dark for some people, and I totally get it, but I loved it. And it's like deliciously dark, in my opinion. Like, it's just so good. I love the setting of this. I love the secret societies and like how messed up they are, and like when we see some of the stuff that they do, it's very interesting. And I like how the fantasy sort of ties into that, and like occult stuff and magic stuff, and there's ghosts, and I just really enjoyed it. The main character is also quite something, and definitely not for everyone. So I do think if you don't like reading about sort of unlikable characters, you might not like this one, but I love reading about characters like her, so I really enjoyed following her. This is also super atmospheric, like the setting of Yale and New Haven. It's just so good, and yeah. It is dark though, like my soul, but it's really good. Then we have another fantasy one, although this one is also historical fiction. It's Babel by R.F. Kuang, and this one starts off in 1828, where we meet our main character who has just become an orphan after his mother dies from cholera. And this mysterious professor, who's sort of been a part of his life, he takes him back to London from China, where he is, to train him in languages in preparation for him entering Oxford University. And it's in preparation of him entering this particular part of the university, which studies translation and magic. The school is like a utopia of learning for the main character, and he makes some friends there. But then the longer he's there, the more he starts to like look into what they're actually doing and how that affects other less privileged people. And then he's approached by this shadow society or like secret society who wants his help to stop what's happening and stop the sort of constant imperial expansion of the British Empire. I really like this one, and again, this is one of those books that has stuck with me and I think about a lot. And again, I really want to reread it actually. I think the magic system in here is really interesting, and how it's tied to language is really fascinating, and I really liked how the author did that. The historical setting is also excellent, the academic setting is excellent, and there's a lot of food for thought in here about like colonialism and power, and it's a very compelling read. Personally, I think it's a little bit heavy-handed with like what it's trying to say, but I still think even then it's definitely worth the read, and it's a very interesting read and one that will make you think, and it's just a very interesting and well-crafted story. The next one we have is These Violent Delights by Micah Nemerever, and this one is set in the early 1970s, where two young men meet at university as freshmen, and they are immediately drawn to each other. But they're quite different people. One comes from a working class background, and he's a very talented artist, but he's kind of insecure and very sensitive, and the other is wealthy, effortlessly charming, but also quite intellectual. And he's definitely charismatic, but he can also sometimes be volatile. The story is about their friendship and how it sort of spirals into this all-consuming thing of obsession and intimacy, and this draws them into this act of violence that really forces them to face the truth of what they're doing and who they are and their relationship. And it's very tense, it's dark and disturbing and just so obsessive. I think it's the most obsessive book I've ever read. I also think this one probably isn't for everyone, but I loved it. I love the writing, I loved reading about the characters, and the whole vibe of the book is just really good, and I felt so pulled into this. And it does have like a level of intimacy to it that you kind of feel like you're looking at something that is very private and you're not supposed to be looking at. And yeah. Of the dark academia books that I've read, I think this is the one that feels the most intimate and like the most all-consuming, but in a good way. Then we have one that's definitely not for everyone, but I really liked it. It's Bunny by Mona Awad, and this book is all vibes. So if you're not into those vibes, you're not gonna like this book, because that's kind of all there is. And also, if you're the kind of reader who really wants answers to all of your questions, this isn't the one, because you won't get them. I really like this one though. It's super weird, but it's so good. It follows a student who is a part of this highly selective writers program at a university in New England. And in her class, there are these unbearable girls who are all friends, and they are obsessed with each other, and they all call each other Bunny, and they're super weird. And they host these like events, and one day our main character gets invited to one of those events and she goes. And then things just go completely off the rail. This book has a lot of atmosphere to it, which I love in books, and the writing style is kind of unique, but I really liked it. It's a mix of a lot of different things, so it is one of those books that's kind of hard to describe, but there's like horror and humor and fantasy and satire all mixed together. And it's the kind of book where you start questioning what's real and what isn't, and who you can trust, and all of those things. And It's a really weird one, but I think if you like weird books, you might like it. We're then back with some more fantasy dark academia for this next one. It's A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, and this one is set at a school for the magically gifted. But the school is kind of weird because it has no teachers and no classes, and so the school just sort of gives you or makes a curriculum for you. It's kind of hard to explain, but in the book it does make sense. And you can't leave the school, like you have to stay there for like there are no holidays or anything, and the whole point is kind of just to survive because there are these monsters that sometimes get into the school even though the school is supposed to keep them out. Sometimes they get in and they feed on magical energy, and people are most vulnerable when they're teenagers. So you can imagine how fun the school is to go to. Our main character possesses a lot of power, but there is a prophecy about her that she will eventually become evil, basically, which is worrying. And her magic is kind of tied up in being really good at destroying things, which sort of feeds into that idea that she may be evil. And it's all a little complicated, but in the book it does make sense. I thought this was a lot of fun, and like the school setting is fantastic. The school is basically built into a sort of void, and I really liked how that was done. And the main character is kind of unlikable, but you know, moody teenagers in general are not very likable, so it sort of makes sense that she's like that. And I really liked all of it. I also really liked how the book ended. There are two more books in this trilogy that I haven't read, and like the way the first book ended really made me want to read the second one, and then I've just forgotten to do it. But I'm really excited to see where the story goes. But at least the first book was really good. Shifting vibes a little bit, next we have Stoner by John Williams. And this one follows a man who was born at the end of the 19th century into a poor, like, farming family, and he's eventually sent to university to study farming. But when he's there, he falls in love with English literature and decides to change paths and pursue this at school instead. And that sounds very romantic and all, but the book is really mostly about how disappointing the life of this man actually is. So it's not like super cheerful. This is a very character driven book, so if you're not into that, you're not gonna like this one, but I loved it because even though this guy has like honestly kind of a depressing life, he does find solace in literature, and that's what keeps him going through everything that happens to him. His estrangement from his family, his failing marriage, his career, which is being sort of halted, and through all of it, he has books and literature and manages to find sort of beauty and meaning in that. I really like the writing in here as well, and I really like how this book captures this idea that your internal life can be very different from your external life. And like it's in a way it's a book that explores the life that you have inside your head and how that can be very meaningful. And I really liked how that was shown, and this really is a very emotional and beautifully written story, and I loved it. I think about it all the time. Next, we have The Likeness by Tana French, which follows a detective who, in the beginning of the story, she is called to this crime scene where the victim looks exactly like her. So the people who were first called to the crime scene actually thought it was her, but it's not. It's just her doppelganger. And that's really weird, but then things get more weird when they find like this ID tag on the victim, and it's the name that the detective used undercover years ago. And obviously all of that is very unsettling. Then as they investigate this case, it sort of stalls. So the idea is brought up that maybe they should send the detective sort of back undercover into the life of the victim to try to lure out the killer. And so she decides to go, and she finds herself in the middle of this friend group of students who all attend the same university, and slowly but surely she gets to know not only the people in the group, but also the victim. This is again quite character driven, I would say, and I found it to be really engaging, and even though it's a little bit of a longer book, I like flew through it. I really like the unraveling of the mystery and the atmosphere, like the friend group, and I love this particular house that the story takes place in, and it's a very complex mystery, and it's an interesting character to follow because the main character is sort of going into the life of this other person that she's been undercover with before, but it's very interesting to follow her sort of almost identity crisis going undercover. And even though it's on the longer side, it's very engaging. This is also technically the second book in a series, but I always say this, like, the books are very loosely related. So the main character that we're following in this book is a side character in the first book. And I haven't read the third one, but I know which character it follows, and it's like a side character in the second book. And I don't think you're missing that much if you haven't read, like, if you don't read them in order, or you haven't read, like, the first book to read this one. You get some things, but it's not, like, super important to the story or the character. Moving on, we have a translated book. It's Vita Nostra by Sergey and Marina Dyachenko. And this one starts off with the main character who's on summer holiday with her mother, and she gets approached by this weird stranger who keeps setting her certain tasks, and if she manages to do it, she gets these, like, coins. I say she gets them in, like, a super weird way. She basically throws them up. So that gives you an idea of how weird all of this is. And at the end of the summer, if she has enough of these coins, she can go to this special I can't remember what it's called, Institute of Special Technologies or something like that. It's a school, and she can go to that school if she gets enough coins. And she's never heard of it. It's in, like, an unknown town. And even though she kind of doesn't want to go, she feels compelled to go, so she does. It's sort of against her family's wishes, but she just feels like she needs to go, so she gets there, and she quickly discovers that this school is unlike anything she's ever been a part of or heard of before. And it's a super weird school. Like, they study books that are impossible to understand. The lessons are very obscure, and the teachers, like, they terrorize the students, and they, like, really scare them, and they sort of keep them in line with coercion and terror. And even though it's horrible, and, like, the students start going through all kinds of different changes, the main character eventually becomes obsessed with the curriculum and what it might unlock. Now, an important thing to note about this one is that it's super weird, and it's kind of like speculative fiction, and it's like a mix of magic and science and philosophy, but it's very conceptual in parts, especially towards the end. And, like, the further into it you get, the more conceptual it becomes, and the end is, like, very bizarre. I still don't know if I really understand the end. Like, it just took some turns that I did not see coming. I don't think anyone can see that coming. And it's the kind of end where you get to it and you're like, wait, what? What even is this? But it's still very good. It's kind of hard to explain. I can imagine some people hating this book, but I really liked it, even though I don't know if I fully understand it. And I kind of felt like I didn't know where I was half the time while reading it, but I really enjoyed it for some reason. Another super weird one is Catherine House by Elisabeth Thomas, which is set at this school which is hidden deep in the woods of rural Pennsylvania, where if you decide to go, you have to stay there for 3 years without leaving, so there are no holidays, and you're completely removed from the outside world. But the people who graduate from there end up becoming, like, the world's best minds, so it's very prestigious. And even though no one really knows what goes on there, it's still, like, it's a very prestigious school to go to, and, you know, it's shrouded in mystery, but the people who come out of it are amazing, so it's an interesting school for sure. Our main character gets into that school sort of despite everything, and it's clear pretty early on that there's a lot of weird stuff going on, and then something happens to one of her roommates. She basically sort of disappears, and our main character starts wondering if there is something deeper going on besides these, like, weird cultish things that are happening. Again, this really just isn't for everyone, and I always say this about this book, but, like, it's all vibes. This book is just almost 100% vibes, and if you're not into those vibes, you're not gonna like it. It's kind of like the same with Bunny, I would say. This one has a very particular sort of claustrophobic, almost hazy feeling to it, and I really liked it, but I can imagine most people probably don't. It also follows a character who is a little bit infuriating because she's kind of apathetic. She doesn't care that much, and she's sort of impassive in a way, with some exceptions. And she can be a little bit infuriating to read about, but For some reason, this just really worked for me. And I do think if you like Bunny, you might like this one, but yeah, it's mostly just vibes, this whole book. Then we're back with some fantasy with The Will of the Many by James Islington, and this is set in this republic where what is referred to as the hierarchy rule everything. And we follow a main character who is an orphan, and he was basically orphaned because of the hierarchy, and no one knows that he is the only survivor of his family. This one is kind of complicated to summarize because a lot happens in this book, but basically our main character gets into this particular university through various events, and he's there to find answers for himself, but he's also there for some other reasons because he sort of has to figure some things out because that's how he got into the school. And he's determined to get revenge for what happened to his family, and he refuses to be controlled. In particular, he refuses to be controlled with the way that the magic system works in this world, which, to very briefly summarize it, it means that the powerful people sort of leech energy off people underneath them, and he doesn't want to take part in that. And it's like a whole, it's so complicated, this book, but it's so good. The thing to note about this one is that even though it has an academic setting, not all of the story takes place at the school, and it actually takes us a little while to get there. I would say that like the first third of the book passes before we get to the school, and we get to see quite a lot of the rest of this world, which I actually really liked because it's a very interesting fantasy world, and it's a very interesting sort of system, I would say. I think this is very engaging. It has a very, very interesting magic system, and there's a lot of twists and turns, and the end is absolutely insane. I I don't think anyone can see that coming. It's so interesting and weird, and I can't wait to read the second book. I think it's coming out soon because I don't know where we're gonna go from that, but I'm sure it's gonna be very interesting. I just think this is really well done. The world is excellent, and I really like the characters. My only complaint about this book is that I don't buy that the main character is 17. He feels much older, but other than that, this is great. Second to last, we have The Maidens by Alex Michaelides, which I know is a book that splits opinions, and this isn't like my favorite book ever, but I do think it has really good dark academia vibes, and I think the atmosphere in this book is excellent, and that really did a lot for me when I was reading this, so I just wanted to include it anyway. This one is set at Cambridge, where we meet this brilliant but troubled therapist who becomes obsessed with the death of her niece's friend, and she is convinced that this charismatic and handsome Greek professor has something to do with it because he is like adored by the members of this secret society of female students known as the Maidens. The ending of this did fall a little bit flat for me, but like the atmosphere of Cambridge in this one is really excellent, and the academic setting is really good, and for 2/3 of this I was like really into it, and then it just sort of tapered off a little bit. But there are some scenes in here that have stuck with me, and I do think it's an interesting mystery even if it isn't perfect. And I'd say that if you want like dark academia autumnal vibes, this has like buckets of it. Like the atmosphere is so good, and I feel like it's worth reading because if nothing else, at least it's entertaining and the vibes are great. Lastly, we have a book that I finished recently and I really liked. It's Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. And this is again fantasy, and it's set in the city that is kind of like a utopia, and it's protected by this huge magical dome, and everything inside of that dome is advanced, whereas everything outside of it is basically wild. Our main character is a woman who has spent the last 20 years obsessively studying magic in the hopes that she will become the first woman to be admitted into the high magistry. And when she finally manages to claw her way in there, she finds that not everyone is happy to have her there, her colleagues are not very welcoming, and they actually assign her a janitor as an assistant instead of someone more qualified. But it actually turns out that this janitor may be the key to unearthing some of the city's secrets, specifically where the sort of power of it comes from. This is a standalone, which I think is really cool, and I just think this is really well done. We have an interesting setting in here, which has a very interesting historical background, which includes some like religion and stuff, which I thought was cool. We have a very interesting magic system, and we have some very interesting characters. The main character is kind of unlikable sometimes, but I really like that, and there are a lot of interesting themes in this book. It explores racism and colonialism, morality, and the sort of price of progress and who that progress benefits. So there's a lot going on, but I think it does all of it really well. That was the last book that I had on today's list, though. I know there were a lot of them, but we finally made it to the end. Now, I would love to know what your favorite dark academia book is, if you like reading them, or if you're interested in reading any of the ones that I mentioned. That was kind of it for today. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!